Macharja, my friends, welcome back to Undercover Irish. Tá fáilte romh. I'm your host, Olin, and on the last episode of Carja we were talking about what Irish county names really mean. We explored an older Ireland, an Ireland of gods and goddesses, of forgotten tribes and ancient kingdoms, of sacred landscapes, forests, ridges, marshes, rivers, an Ireland that existed long before the counties we know today. But Ireland didn't stay frozen in time. New peoples arrived, new religions spread, new languages took root and influenced the landscape. And every one of them left their mark on the map. Because some county names preserve saints, some preserve Vikings, Norse power, and some preserve colonisation, colonial power, or at least remember it, and some preserve all three at the same time. Because when you think about it, every single new arrival left something behind. The Vikings left towns, the saints left churches, and empires left administrative boundaries, the type that they used to exploit and extract from the land. And yet somehow much of older Ireland survived underneath it all alongside of it. Episode 1 was all about uncovering the Ireland beneath the counties. This episode is about uncovering the Ireland hidden inside them. Because county names aren't just labels, they're records of settlement, trade, religion, power, conflict, and survival. So let's begin with maybe the most famous place name in Ireland. A place where the Irish Oscailga and the English names don't mean the same thing. According to my friends, before the Vikings arrived, Ireland had monasteries. It had tribal territories, it had royal centres, but it didn't really have cities, urbanisation as we understand it today. The Vikings, the Norsemen, changed that. They first arrived as raiders, and then later as traders and settlers. Many of Ireland's most important urban centres still carry traces of their presence, not just in archaeology, not just in street layouts, but in their names. Dublin, County Dublin, Oscailga in Irish known as Baile Átha Cliath. Most people assume that Dublin and Baile Átha Cliath are simply two versions of the same name, but they're not. The English name Dublin is an anglicisation of two Irish words, Dubh Linn, the black pool, Dubh Linn, a dark tidal pool that once existed near the site of modern Dublin Castle. Meanwhile, the official Irish name is Baile Átha Cliath, the town of the hurdled ford. The Á was a river crossing, a Cliath was a hurdle or a woven structure used to help people cross. What's fascinating about this is that they weren't originally even the exact same place. The Black Pool on the Lindove and the ford were neighbouring locations, two landmarks, two settlements, two identities, you could say. When Viking settlers established a lung fort, a fortified ship encampment near Dubh Linn during the 9th century, the area began to grow. Over time, the settlements merged and the city expanded. And eventually the names became attached to the same place. So modern Dublin preserves two different versions of early Ireland. One connected to native Irish settlement, the other connected to Viking urban development. By the 11th century, Dublin had become one of the largest slave trading centres in Western Europe. Captives from Ireland and Britain were brought and sold through the city's markets. When we think of Viking Dublin, we often picture warriors, but in reality, it was also a major international trading hub connected to networks stretching across the Irish Sea and deep into Scandinavia. Dublin's two names don't tell the story of one city, they tell the story of two places becoming one. Another place inextricably linked to Viking and Viking settlement is County Waterford. Waterford. The Irish, we know it as, is Port Loriga. Port Loriga. If Dublin shows us Vikings transforming an existing settlement, Waterford shows us Vikings building something new entirely. The Irish name Port Loriga translates as Lorug's Port. We're not entirely sure who Lorug was, but the name appears to preserve the memory of a person associated with the harbour. The English name tells a completely different story. It originates from Old Norse, an Old Norse description. It usually is translated as windy fjord. Windy fjord. Think about how different those perspectives are. The Irish name Port Loriga remembers a person. The Viking name remembers the experience of arriving by sea. One is personal, one is practical. And maybe that's exactly how sailors viewed this place. Waterford occupies a deep natural harbour protected from the Atlantic. A perfect location for traders and settlers, which is exactly why the Vikings chose it. Founded in 914, Waterford is Ireland's oldest city. Not its oldest settlement, but its oldest city. From the very beginning, Waterford was urban, built around trade, built around maritime connections, and built around a wider Viking world. Depending on the name you use, Waterford or Port Loriga, you either remember a person or the weather. And it is interesting to note that in those two examples, the Irish and the English versions are very different. In the same vein, you have County Wexford. Now, County Wexford is the English version of it. Loch Garman is the Irish. The Irish name Loch Garman is essentially Garman's Lake or Garman's Inlet. According to Irish tradition, the name is connected to a legendary figure named Garman. Details vary depending on the source, but the important point is the Irish name is rooted in story and local tradition. The English name tells a completely different story. Again, Wexford comes from Old Norse, probably and possibly meaning something close to mud flat fjord. Mud flat fjord. Again, the contrast is fascinating. The Irish remembers a legend, a local legend, and the Viking name remembers a harbour. One group, again, placing the name after memory, and the other group naming it after navigation. Both names survived. Wexford became one of the most important Norse settlements in Ireland and remained heavily influenced by Scandinavian culture long after the Viking Age itself ended. The Irish remember a story, the Vikings remember a harbour. Now, Carja, my friends, one of the things that unifies the examples we've looked at so far is how layered they are. But there's probably no county as layered in terms of its naming and identity as County Wicklow. So County Wicklow is known as Gaeilge in Irish as Kilvanton, the Church of Manton. Now, according to tradition, Manton was a follower of Saint Patrick. Legend says he lost his teeth after being attacked by locals, and Patrick instructed him to place the teeth back into his mouth and establish a church on the site. Whether it's true or not, the story reminds us that Christianity spread through people as much as through institutions. But the English name tells a different story. Wicklow almost certainly comes from Old Norse. Its exact meaning is debated, but most interpretations point towards a Viking place name. So the county preserves two completely different historical layers, one Christian, one Viking, one looking inland and one looking towards the sea. And for centuries, the Wicklow Mountains would become a refuge for those resisting outside authority, whether it be Gaelic clans and chieftains, outlaws, and later rebels during the 1798 rebellion. The mountains protected them all. Wicklow is one county, but it contains at least two completely different histories layered. One of the features, Accordia, of some Irish place names is that there can be debate attached to the correct name. Now, Donegal might be one of the most revealing county names in Ireland from this perspective, because most people know the county Osgailga as Dún na Ngáll, the fort of the foreigners, Dún meaning fort, na Ngáll meaning foreigners. Now, immediately the question arises, who were the foreigners? Most historians would believe that the name refers to the Vikings, although exactly who is being described remains debated. And Donegal is simply an anglicisation of Dún na Ngáll. But Donegal has another historic name, and if Tyrone is an anglicisation of Tír Owen, the land of Owen, Donegal's other name is similar, Tír Chonaill, the land of Conall. This is named after Conall Golban, son of Niall of the 9 hostages and ancestor of the Cainneach Conall dynasty. Tír Chonaill, the land of Conall. So these two names point in opposite directions. Dún na Ngáll remembers outsiders, whereas Tír Chonaill remembers people who already lived there. One tells the story of arrival and the other tells a story of belonging. For centuries, this was the homeland of Cainneach Conall, and later the powerful O'Donnell dynasty. The O'Donnells became one of the most influential Gaelic families in Ireland, and were among the last great lords to resist English conquest. Dún na Ngáll is the story of invasion, Tír Chonaill is the story of identity. Now, the Vikings can claim massive influence in terms of transforming Ireland's ports and towns and urbanisation. But there already was another revolution, if you like, taking place and reshaping Ireland. And this one wasn't about arriving in longships. It would arrive through monasteries, churches, and saints. Christianity arrived in Ireland long before the Vikings. And unlike the Vikings, Christianity didn't build cities, but it transformed the landscape itself, and particularly the naming structure. The old Ireland of sacred wells, holy trees, and ritual sites didn't simply disappear. In many cases, Christianity built itself directly on top of what was already there. A sacred spring would become a holy well. A sacred hill would become a monastery. An old gathering place might become a church. And this is one of the reasons why Christianity was so successful in Ireland, because it adapted to what was already there in terms of incorporating beliefs. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the names of several Irish counties, starting with County Kildare. In Irish, Kildare is known as Kildare, Cunte Kildare, the Church of the Oak. At first glance, it sounds straightforward, a church beside an oak tree. But there may be something else going on here. Long before Christianity arrived, oak trees held enormous significance in Celtic society. They were symbols of strength, of wisdom, and of sacred power. Across Europe, oak groves were often associated with ritual activity and religious practice, which means Kildare may preserve an overlap between pagan and Christian Ireland. The county takes its name from the monastery established by Saint Brigid, Nave Brigid, one of Ireland's most important saints. But Brigid herself is a fascinating figure, because many scholars have noted striking similarities between Saint Brigid, Nave Brigid, and an older Celtic goddess, Brigid. Both are associated with healing, poetry, fire, fertility, and protection. Whether the connection is coincidence or a cultural adaptation remains debated, but the overlap is difficult to ignore. And it's also fitting because Christianity in Ireland often absorbed older traditions rather than completely replacing them. One of the most famous traditions associated with Kildare, was Saint Brigid's sacred fire. And according to medieval sources, the flame was maintained continuously by generations of women for centuries. A Christian tradition, or maybe rooted in something older. Kildare is a clear example of pagan Ireland becoming Christian Ireland. And of course, Kil, meaning church, is also present in County Kilkenny. Kilkenny, the church of Cainneach or Canis. Unlike Kildare, Kilkenny's origins are less mysterious. The county takes its name from Saint Cainneach, or Canis in English. One of the most important early Irish saints, a contemporary of Saint Columba, and one of the great monastic founders of early medieval Ireland. And while other counties have been named after tribes or fighters or the landscape, this one is explicitly named after a church. Now, it tells us how important this is in medieval Ireland. The church isn't just a religious institution, it's often a centre of education, of administration, of learning, of local power. For many communities at that time, the monastery was the town and the church was the centre of life. Centuries later, Kilkenny would become one of the wealthiest Norman occupation settlements in Ireland. Its medieval streetscape still survives today, but the county's name remembers an even older chapter, the age of saints and monasteries. The county isn't named after a ruler, it's named after a holy man. And from a traditionally hurling county to a traditional football county of County Roscommon. Next up is Roscommon. Roscommon, Oscailga, in Irish Roscommon. So the English name is simply an anglicisation of the Irish again. Comán's Wood. The county takes its name from Saint Comán, who established a monastery in this area during the 6th century. The first part of the name, Ross, usually refers to a wooded height or a wooded area. So Roscommon literally preserves both the landscape and the saint associated with it. What makes places like Roscommon so important is that they remind us of how central monasteries were to Irish society and how important landscape and landscape features were. And when people think of medieval learning, they think about or they imagine universities. They imagine Oxford, Cambridge, or Paris. But long before many of Europe's great universities emerged, Irish monasteries were already preserving manuscripts, copying texts, and producing scholars. Monasteries acted like schools, like libraries, administration centres, and sometimes places of refuge. In many parts of Ireland, they were the important institution. Now, unlike Roscommon, Kilkenny, and Kildare, Roscommon, Kildare, agus Kilkenny, the next place is not named after a church or a saint. County Down. Its name is much older. Undune, the Irish, simply means the fort. This is a really common place name around Ireland. So any one that begins with Dun is Undune and comes from fort. Now this probably refers to an ancient stronghold that dominated the area. And yet the anglicisation of it, Down, became Christian because of one man, Saint Patrick. Downpatrick has long been associated with Patrick's final resting place. Tradition says that Patrick is buried there alongside Saint Brigid and Columba. Whether the tradition is historically accurate is difficult to prove, but its importance is undeniable. For centuries, pilgrims travelled to Downpatrick in County Down because they believed that they were visiting the burial place of Ireland's patron saint. And that creates an interesting contrast because the county name remembers a fort, but the county itself became associated with Ireland's most famous missionary. A reminder that names don't always tell the whole story. Sometimes history adds new layers and layers upon layers. The county remembers a fort, but Ireland remembers the saint. And if on Doon, the fort portrays stronghold or strength, there's another county that literally does that too. Longford comes from the Gaeilge on Long Fort, the stronghold or the fortification. At first glance, Longford sounds like something that should be connected to a long stretch of land. Maybe a ridge or a valley, but that's simply the anglicisation, misleading us. The Irish name tells a different story. On Long Fort, the fortified enclosure, a defended settlement, a stronghold, the kind of place that offered protection in a world that was uncertain. And what's very interesting is that the word Longford has a special place in Irish history. When the Vikings first arrived in Ireland, they established fortified ship camps along rivers and harbours. And the Irish called these settlements Longfort. In Dublin, for example, it began its life as a Longfort. So when we hear the word today, it's often associated with Viking Ireland, but the idea is much older than the Vikings themselves. Fortified settlements were a feature of Irish life long before the first long ship arrived on the horizon. Longford preserves that memory, a landscape not defined by river or forest or saint, but by defence, security, the need to protect people and the surrounding area. For centuries, much of the area was controlled by the O'Farrell dynasty, one of the leading Gaelic families of the Irish Midlands. Their strongholds helped maintain Gaelic authority in the region long after other parts of Ireland had come under outside influence. Longford's name reminds us that medieval Ireland wasn't just a land of monasteries and kingdoms, it was also a land of fortifications and of defended settlements, of families determined to hold on to their territory. Now, Christianity changed how Irish people worshipped over time. It changed how communities organised themselves, and it changed how people understood the landscape around them in some cases. But later rulers would attempt something even more ambitious and audacious. They would try to change how Ireland remembered itself, and names would be part of that. Corja, the Vikings changed Irish towns. Christianity changed Ireland's spiritual landscape, but later administrations attempted something more audacious. They tried to change how Ireland understood itself. Because if names preserve memory, then changing, altering or obscuring names can change memory too, or even delete it. And nowhere is that more obvious than in Ireland's place names. If we think of Corja about County Derry, Dira, the oak grove. It's simple, it's ancient, and it's immediately familiar because we've encountered this one before. Earlier we were talking about Kildare, the Church of the Oak. Now these are two different counties and they're different regions, but both preserve the memory of something that was held in enormous significance in Ireland, the oak tree. And for Celtic societies, this was really important. We mentioned the strength, the endurance, and the sacred power, and how entire communities gather around these areas. So when we see names like Dira and Dara appearing repeatedly in Irish place names, we're seeing traces of an older landscape and an older spirituality. A more heavily forested Ireland. The settlement at Derry grew around the monastery founded by Saint Columba. For centuries it was known as Dira, but it also became known as Dira Columba because of that connection to Christianity. So Dira Columba means the oak grove of Columba. And that's an amazing evolution over time. An older landscape survives. And Christianity adds another layer on top of it. The oak grove remains, but now it's attached to a saint. But then, Corja, comes another layer again. The plantation of Ulster. In the early 17th century, English and Scottish settlers were encouraged to establish themselves across much of Ulster, and it involved the taking of native land. A lot of London guilds financed this plantation project, as you would imagine. And as a result of this, they attempted to put the name London onto the city as well, alongside of Derry. Suddenly, one place contains multiple versions of history. Saint Columba, Derry, and a new attempt to put a colonial name onto the county and the city. And this brings us, Accordia, to a question around it, because it wasn't unique to Derry. It's the colonisation of language. Some English administrators believed that language itself was one of the greatest obstacles to controlling Ireland. And one of the examples would be Edmund Spenser. And we've met Edmund Spenser on previous podcasts. Spenser not only theorised about how to control and conquer Ireland, he lived here. And in a political work called A View of the Present State of Ireland, he argued that Irish customs, Irish laws, Irish language helped preserve the resistance against English rule. And for Spenser, conquering Ireland wasn't simply about military victory, it was cultural. If Irish people continued speaking Irish, Gaeilge, using Irish place names, and organising themselves around Irish traditions, then English control would never be complete. The country could not be occupied, and it could not be transformed. But his idea to go after the language and the naming structure in Ireland was an idea that would influence generations of policy. Because language, as we've seen on this podcast time and time again, carries memory, and memory can resist power. Over time, Ireland's place names increasingly passed through English administration. Some names were translated, but most were altered, or simplified, or misunderstood. An Irish-speaking local might provide a place name, and an English-speaking surveyor would write down the name as he heard it. The spelling would be entered into official records, and eventually it would become the recognised version. Over generations, the original meaning could become blurred or disappear entirely. And this process was accelerated dramatically by the 19th century Ordnance Survey. Beginning in the 1820s, surveyors undertook the most detailed mapping project Ireland had ever seen. And in many ways, it became an extraordinary achievement, but it also transformed the linguistic landscape. Irish place names had to be standardised, recorded, and catalogued. Many Irish names survived, but often in altered forms. Pronunciation shifted, spellings changed, and meanings became obscured. The map increasingly reflected the English administration through Anglicisation. And even in places where Irish remained the language of everyday life, this happened. In a sense, Ireland was being translated, not geographically, but linguistically. And that brings us, Accordia, to something which is really important. This is the reason why Irish place names matter. They're not just labels, they're archives. Every place name contains information about geography, about ecology, about religion, about settlement, about power, about memory. When we hear Derry, we know that there was an oak grove there. When we hear Kildare, we know about a church and a sacred tree. When we hear Tyrone or Tirchonel, we found traces of old kingdoms. When we hear Ballyochlia, we uncover a river crossing that existed long before modern Dublin. The names preserve information about something that survives nowhere else. These are historical documents described as ordinary words. And when a place name disappears, sometimes an entire piece of history disappears with it. It could be a forest, it could be a tribe, it could be a saint, it could be a kingdom, or a philosophy, a way of understanding the landscape. Just gone. This is why place names matter. They're not simply about the past. They're one of the ways the past continues speaking into the present. And despite years and centuries of conquest, plantation, administration, Anglicisation, many of Ireland's older place names survived and survive. Some places even carry several different histories at the same time. Several languages, several identities, several versions of Ireland, all layered together in a single county. Sinna bhfuil a Carda, that's it for this episode, part 2. This was part 2 of an episode where we looked at Irish county names and their meaning. I really enjoyed putting these 2 episodes together, Accordia. If you haven't heard the first one, please do listen back to it. But for now, Accordia, gurv míle maith agad film. Thank you so much for being with me. If you've enjoyed this particular episode, Accordia, I'd ask you to like and subscribe or leave a comment or review wherever you listen to this particular podcast. It makes an absolute massive difference. Also, Accordia, if you want to support, go to Patreon, look up Undercover Irish, and as always, my thanks, mo bhuíochas, to those who support this show on Patreon. Gurv míle maith agad. So for now, Accordia, until the next time on Undercover Irish, thank you for being with me. Slán go fóla, Accordia, agus beirigí bua.